Hello. In this video, we would like to show how to deseasonalize a time series. So in this case, I have some demand that has seasonality in it, and I have 3 years of demand. And really for seasonality, you need to look at least 3 years or 3 big cycles or periods where you would expect to see the same kind of pattern. So here I have some demand data from 2008, 2009, and 2010. And I've gone ahead and computed the seasonal indices for those for the different months, the monthly indices. And the way I did that was for the January index, I took the average of all Januaries. And if we click on that, I think you can see those are all the Januaries. And then for the other months, similar. So let's just click on November and see that there's 3 Novembers there. So these are the averages over each of the months, and so the composite column here represents how we typically do in each of these months. So typically for January, on average, we expect about 42 for demand. Typically on average in February, we expect about 61. And then in May and July, there's sort of a huge bump up, and this is what we typically get in May over this 3-year span. And so that's the beginning of calculating the indices. You calculate a composite or an average over the different months, and then you take an overall average, which is the average of each of these values up here, and compute that, and that's 129. You can also get the same overall average by taking the average over all of the values over here as well too. It turns out that those two numbers are exactly the same. The average over the composite or the average over all of the historical demand is exactly the same. It's just 129. So okay, so to get the indices, the way we do that calculation is we compare each of these typical values from the different months to what we get overall, or the overall average, to see how it compares. And we compare them in the form of an index, and the index just comes from dividing January or the composite average up here by the overall average. So if we click on this, you can see kind of how that went. So we took the January average and divided by the overall average, and that left us with an index of 0.33. And basically what that means is in January we can expect on average to be 67% below the baseline 129. And likewise for these values down here, for February we expect to be 53% below this average value down here. And likewise for the indices bigger than 1, here's one bigger than 1. So in September we expect to be about 5% above this baseline average of 129. Now if you sum those indices, they should add up to 12, so we've done that here, and that checks out and shows us that our index calculation was okay. So there's the seasonal indices, and what I'm going to show you in this video is how to actually deseasonalize this demand. So right now let's get a look at the demand. So if I look at the 3 years and say insert chart, so there's my time series, and it looks, I can definitely see the seasonality there. And as usual, I'm going to put in the little lollipops. So there's the lollipops, they go in there. And I'm not going to change the axis down here because we're going to look at a graph like this in a minute that has some other stuff on it as well too. But definitely you can see the seasonality here. And there's two, looks like there's 2 big peaks and then a bunch of stuff that's low. And I can see 1, 2, 3 versions of this pattern. So that represents those 3 different years, 2008, 2009, and 2010. So I'm going to go ahead and take the seasonality out of this data, and what that means is I should wind up with something very smooth once I do that, or at least more smooth than what it looks like now. And this is a common thing you do in data analysis, is take a component that you understand and remove it from your data so that you can examine what's left over. So this is a very common thing when you're doing things like taking out trend. If you're doing regression analysis, you might take out a trend so that you can see the noise or the residual left over. So that way you can see the kind of true baseline that you have with the effects of the seasonality factored out. So that's the purpose of this process. I'm going to divide out the seasonality so I can get a clear view of where things are improving or going down, declining in terms of the demand and how it's looking for these 3 years. All right, so that's where we're headed. I'm going to get rid of this graph for now and come back to a graph in a little bit. But the first thing I'm going to do, in order to take the seasonality out, and we've said this before, when you put seasonality in, you multiply by an index. So you would take non-seasonal data, multiply by an index to give it seasonality. So to take it out, I'm going to divide by this index. So over here, I'm going to take each of these demand values in column B, which has the seasonality sort of baked into it, and then divide by this index to take it out. So here we go with that. So I'm going to take this demand and divide out the January index, and that gives me 86. And then I'm going to continue to do this for the first year. I can't go past the first year because it's going to drag off the end for my reference over there. That's where the reference is over there. So there's probably an elegant way to do this, but I'm just going to reset it so that it's this value divided by, and start the index back up here for this second year. So that's the seasonal demand for January, the second year, and then drag it down to December. And again, I can't go beyond December because it'll drag off over there, but I'm just going to reset this calculation right here. And there's probably a much more elegant way to do that, but I'm just going to do it by hand this time. Now drag this down, so that's 2010. And now I'm going to actually put the average, this overall average, in here as well too, so I can compare it. Because once I have the deseasonal demand, I can better compare to the average overall. And I'm interested in whether or not my deseasonal demand in the end is sort of above the average or below it. So I'm going to take this reference over here. And I want that to be always referring to that cell, so I'm going to make that absolute. And then let's drag it down. Okay, so now I have the 3 columns I need. I got the regular demand, I have the deseasonal demand, and I have the overall average as well too. So let's take a look at those 3 different graphs and see if we can make sense of them. So I'm going to select all the data here, and we'll take a look. I'm going to say Insert Chart. And I get this crazy chart like that. I don't want that. I want, oh, here it is. Okay, I want the line graph. So that's my line graph. That looks much better. And I'm going to move it over, and let's customize it. I'm going to put the little dots on it, the lollipops. So there's my lollipops. I'm also going to make, for the horizontal axis, I'm going to make the labels turn up at 90 degrees and also make them a little bit darker, maybe bold. And I'm going to do one last thing. If I come down to the grid lines, I'm going to make it so that it displays all the labels there. One way to do that, oops, that's on the wrong axis. So I want to undo that. I want the horizontal axis, and I'm looking at major count is the field that I want there, and that puts in all the labels like that. Okay, I think that's good. I'm going to put this down, and I'm going to make it a little bit bigger, and also make it a little bit taller so I can see. And now I want to try to interpret this graph. So excuse me. So one interpretation for this graph is to look at this overall average, and once we've taken the seasonality out of the data, I can compare the value that I get with the seasonality out to the overall average. And if the value of the deseasonal demand is above this overall average, then that's an indication of a month where demand was higher than normal. And so by higher than normal, what I mean is maybe compared to similar months in this same time span. So if we look at this January, here's one spot where this deseasonal demand is very high. It's kind of the highest that I get there. But if I compare that January, it looks like it's about here. The demand was 84. And the red graph, the deseasonal demand, is telling me that that was a particularly good month. And the reason that was a good month is because when I look at the other Januaries, the demand was much lower. So if I look at this January, the demand was 28. If I look at the January over here, the demand was 14. So compared to those two, this January with a demand of 84 looks very good. So this was a very strong January in terms of comparison to the other years involved here. And likewise, for the red graph that is very low, if you find a spot where the red graph is very low, what that indicates is a weak month where demand was lower than normal. So here's one that's in June where the deseasonal demand was 19, and it's quite a bit below this average, which means that was a weak month. And if you compare it to the other Junes, you'll see why that is. So here's a June where the demand is 19. If you look at the June over here, the demand here, wait, let's go back. The demand over here, the regular demand was 14, but if I look at the demand over here in June, it was 182, so quite a bit better. And then over here for the regular demand in June, that was 84. So this June looks particularly weak with regard to that. And I can see the blue dot is kind of right below that at 14. So the deseasonal demand kind of, the graph goes down to indicate that that was a weak month. So this graph really shows us a lot of stuff. Here's an example of two strong months. March and April in 2008 were particularly strong. And then here's a few strong months here as well too. And then over here at the end of the graph this year, these are all examples of very weak months where the demand was low compared to other months of those same type. So for example, for February, here's the demand was 42, and then the demand over here was 98, and then over here the demand in February was 42 again. So this February here with demand of 42 looks a little bit low overall. So in summary, what you can say is where the deseasonal graph winds up above the average, those are particularly strong months, and where the deseasonal graph winds up below the average, those were weaker than normal months. Demand was weaker than what we expected to get. So even if these peaks up here are fairly high, because we expect to normally get those peaks, you sort of figure that in and discount that in the graph of the deseasonalized data. So the deseasonal data will be sort of smooth in between, not completely smooth. You're going to see some ups and downs, but definitely smoother than the overall pattern with seasonality.